happens when the most protected residence in Russia goes dark just days before the new year? And what message was Ukraine really sending by choosing that moment? That question hung over Europe's security community as reports emerged from the frozen forests near Valdai, where Russia's most secretive presidential retreat briefly became the center of a strategic shockwave. And here is the question for viewers right at the start. If a site guarded by layers of elite air defenses can be touched, what does that say about the safety of anything else? At exactly 3:51 in the morning on December 29th, the Valdai residence, often described by Russian media as an untouchable inner sanctum, was struck by a coordinated Ukrainian drone operation. This was not a symbolic flyover or a propaganda stunt. It was a carefully timed, operationally dense attack involving nearly 100 unmanned systems probing the heart of Russia's internal security architecture. Snow-covered pine forests, normally a natural shield, became part of the battlefield. For several tense minutes, one of the most heavily defended locations on Earth was blind, silent, and visibly damaged. The scale of what unfolded matters. Valdai is not just a luxury retreat. It is a decision-making hub where strategic meetings are held and where Russia's leadership retreats during moments of international tension. Protecting it requires a concentration of S-400 batteries, Pantsir systems, electronic warfare vehicles, and radar nodes that taken together represent billions of dollars in sunk cost. When Ukraine chose this target, it was not attempting to decapitate leadership. It was conducting what Western analysts describe as a strategic audit under fire. The timing amplified the message. The strike came as diplomatic contacts were quietly intensifying ahead of the new year, with NATO states signaling continued military and financial support for Kyiv under a U.S. administration led by President Donald Trump. Washington's posture remained firm. Ukraine would be supported long enough to impose sustained economic and military pressure on Moscow. Against that backdrop, the Valdai strike looked less like escalation for escalation's sake, and more like leverage proof that Russian defenses, no matter how expensive, could still be penetrated. Economically, the imbalance was stark. Russia responded by launching interceptors that cost hundreds of thousands, in some cases, millions of dollars each, against drones built at a fraction of that price. Defense News and Military Watch magazine have repeatedly noted that modern air defense systems were never designed for prolonged saturation attacks of this kind. Each interception drained inventories that are difficult to replenish under sanctions and wartime production limits. Even a successful defense carried a price tag that rippled far beyond the forest. Politically and psychologically, the effect was immediate. Moscow emphasized interception rates, but avoided detailed discussion of what was hit. Western observers focused on what mattered more, not the percentage stopped, but the few that got through. In modern warfare, that margin can define outcomes. And as smoke drifted over Valdai, one uncomfortable question remained unanswered. If this was only the opening move, what would come next? As daylight crept across Western Russia, a more unsettling picture began to emerge. The Valdai strike was not about a single breach, but about exposing systemic weaknesses through scale and deception. How many layers of defense are enough when an opponent stops playing by traditional rules? That question now dominated quiet discussions inside NATO planning rooms and Russian command centers alike. The Ukrainian operation unfolded as a textbook saturation attack, a method Western air defense analysts have warned about for years. Instead of relying on a small number of high-value weapons, Kyiv unleashed volume, variety, and timing. Nearly 100 drones approached Valdai at low altitude, exploiting terrain masking created by rolling hills, frozen riverbeds, and dense forest. At such heights, radar coverage becomes fragmented, forcing defenders to react rather than anticipate. What appeared on Russian screens was not a neat formation, but a chaotic swarm arriving from multiple vectors. Russia's air defense network around Valdai represents the pinnacle of its layered doctrine. S-400 systems are designed to track hundreds of targets at extreme range, while Pantsir systems provide close-in protection against aircraft, missiles, and drones. Electronic warfare units add another layer, flooding the electromagnetic spectrum to blind and confuse incoming threats. On paper, this bubble should be impenetrable. In practice, Ukraine turned its strength into a liability. Decoy drones played a crucial role. Cheap airframes, some modified to enhance radar visibility, forced Russian operators into worst-case assumptions. Faced with what looked like high-value targets, defenders responded aggressively, launching interceptors at a rate that quickly became unsustainable. According to Western defense analysts cited by Reuters, this is exactly the scenario modern air defenses struggle with. When every object could be lethal, everything must be treated as lethal. The economic math was brutal. For every low-cost drone destroyed, Russia burned through missiles that cannot be rapidly replaced. Sanctions have constrained access to components, while wartime demand has already stretched production lines. Defense News has repeatedly highlighted that Russia's advanced air defense missiles are among its most expensive and technologically complex assets. Using them against mass-produced drones is effective tactically, but punishing strategically. Meanwhile, NATO planners were watching closely. The alliance has invested heavily in air and missile defense. But Ukraine's approach offered a glimpse into how future conflicts might unfold even against Western systems. The lesson was uncomfortable, but clear layered defenses are not invulnerable. They are only as resilient as their ability to manage volume over time. A system designed to stop a handful of threats can be overwhelmed by dozens, even if most are neutralized. By the time Russian crews began to realize the scope of the engagement, the battle had already shifted. Decoys had drawn fire, inventories were thinning, and command systems were under strain. The defenses were still standing, but they were bending. And in modern warfare, bending is often the moment just before something breaks. If the saturation phase exposed the outer limits of Russia's air defenses, the next phase went after something far more critical: confidence in electronic warfare dominance. For years, Moscow has promoted its jamming capabilities as a decisive advantage, capable of turning entire regions into digital dead zones. The Valdai strike challenged that assumption in real time. And the question viewers should be asking here is simple but unsettling: what happens when drones no longer need the signals you are trying to jam? As Russian operators activated powerful electronic warfare systems around Valdai, the airwaves filled with broadband interference. GPS signals were disrupted, radio links flooded, and command networks strained under the load. In previous encounters, such measures had proven highly effective against conventional drones, which rely on satellite navigation and continuous communication with operators. This time, however, the Ukrainian planners had anticipated that response. A portion of the attacking drones shifted seamlessly into autonomous mode. Equipped with onboard processing and terrain recognition software, these systems no longer depended on external signals. Using preloaded maps and real-time visual data, they navigated by matching terrain features, forests, riverbends, road patterns to stored reference models. Western analysts, including experts quoted by the BBC and Defense News, have noted that this approach mirrors technologies already used in civilian autonomous vehicles adapted for wartime conditions. The result was a quiet but profound failure of electronic warfare. As Russian jammers intensified, some drones fell out of the sky exactly as expected. Others, however, continued unaffected, their behavior indistinguishable from before. From the perspective of Russian operators, this was deeply disorienting. The tools designed to blind the attacker were suddenly irrelevant to a portion of the threat. This moment carries broader implications. NATO militaries have invested heavily in electronic warfare, viewing control of the electromagnetic spectrum as a cornerstone of modern conflict. The Valdai strike underscored a growing concern. Autonomy reduces vulnerability. Once a system can think and navigate independently, jamming becomes a blunt instrument rather than a decisive weapon. Al Jazeera analysts have described this shift as a quiet revolution, one that favors adaptability over raw power. Economically, the consequences again favored Ukraine. Autonomous drones cost more than basic decoys, but still a fraction of the systems deployed to stop them. Each minute Russia spent flooding the airwaves consumed fuel-strained generators and diverted assets from other fronts. In a war defined by attrition, even these hidden costs accumulate. As the electronic battle raged, Russian defenses faced an uncomfortable reality. They could still shoot down many drones, but they could no longer control the terms of the engagement. The initiative had shifted, and as autonomy quietly slipped through the digital fog, The stage was set for a far more consequential development, one that would test not just Russia's technology, but the resilience of its entire defensive doctrine. By the time the engagement reached its most intense phase, the Valdai strike had stopped being a purely tactical event and become an exercise in economic pressure. This was where the imbalance truly revealed itself. The question now confronting Russian planners and quietly worrying NATO analysts was not whether the defenses could intercept drones, but how long they could afford to keep doing so. As the drone wave persisted, Russian units were forced to escalate their responses. Short-range systems began to exhaust ready-to-fire interceptors, requiring reloads that take precious minutes in the middle of a fight. With close-in defenses, strained higher-tier systems were drawn into roles they were never designed for. S-400 batteries built to counter aircraft and ballistic missiles were launched against small, fast-moving drones. Each interceptor fired represented an enormous financial decision made in seconds. According to estimates cited by Defense News and Military Watch magazine, individual S-400 missiles can cost anywhere from several $100,000 to over $1 million depending on configuration. By contrast, even advanced Ukrainian drones involved in the Valdai operation are believed to cost a small fraction of that amount. The result was a textbook case of cost exchange asymmetry. Russia could claim tactical success while losing strategically with every launch. This imbalance matters far beyond Valdai. Russia's missile production capacity is already under strain from sustained operations across multiple fronts and from sanctions limiting access to key components. Every interceptor expended defending a presidential retreat is one fewer available to protect logistics hubs, industrial centers, or occupied territory. Western military economists have long argued that forcing an adversary to spend disproportionately is a form of indirect warfare, and Ukraine executed that concept with precision. NATO observers were paying close attention. Similar dilemmas exist within Western defense planning, particularly as low-cost drones proliferate globally. The Valdai strike offered a real-world stress test of high-end air defense against persistent low-cost threats. For alliance planners, the lesson was sobering. Even technologically superior systems can be financially exhausted if forced into prolonged asymmetric engagements. Inside Russia, the psychological strain on operators compounded the economic damage. Crews were making split-second decisions knowing that each launch depleted a finite and irreplaceable stockpile. The pressure to protect a symbol of state power left little room for restraint. In that environment, efficiency gave way to urgency, and urgency is expensive. As the night wore on, the numbers told a grim story. Dozens of drones destroyed millions of dollars spent, and yet the engagement was not over. The defenses were still firing, but cracks were forming not in armor or concrete, but in sustainability. And as inventories thinned and fatigue set in, the most dangerous phase was approaching, one where a handful of surviving systems could achieve outsized effects and rewrite the outcome of the entire operation. When the final phase began, the question was no longer how many drones remained in the air, but whether a handful could change the meaning of the entire operation. If most threats are stopped, does the defense still fail when just a few reach the right targets? That dilemma sat at the heart of what unfolded next around Valdai. As Russian air defenses focused on intercepting the remaining visible threats, a small number of drones slipped into positions that mattered far more than raw numbers suggested. These were not aimed at buildings or personnel. They were aimed at the nervous system of the defensive bubble itself. Secondary radar arrays, command antennas, electronic warfare nodes, and backup power systems became the priority. Western analysts later described this as functional targeting, disabling capability rather than causing spectacle. The strikes were precise and restrained. Instead of large explosions designed to maximize damage, impacts were optimized to neutralize sensitive electronics. Radar components were rendered inoperable. Communication links were severed. Jamming systems fell silent. For several critical minutes, sections of the Valdai defense network lost both situational awareness and coordination. The residence remained standing, but its protective shell was compromised. This approach reflected a broader evolution in Ukrainian strategy. Rather than seeking symbolic destruction, Kyiv focused on disproving assumptions. The assumption here was that Russia's most valuable sites could not be meaningfully disrupted without overwhelming force. By proving otherwise, Ukraine demonstrated that even a limited breach can carry disproportionate consequences. According to Western defense experts cited by Reuters and the BBC, this kind of attack is designed to force adversaries into costly overcorrections. The economic implications deepened. Repairing high-end radar and electronic warfare systems is neither fast nor cheap, especially under sanctions. Specialized components often require months to replace, even in peacetime. Every damaged node represents not just immediate vulnerability, but long-term strain on logistics and budgets. In this sense, the drones that got through may have cost Russia far more than those that were intercepted. Politically, the impact rippled outward. Moscow emphasized interception rates, but avoided discussing degraded systems. Western governments read between the lines. NATO officials speaking anonymously to European media framed the incident as further evidence that Russia's defensive posture is under constant stress. Under a U.S. administration led by President Donald Trump, Washington continued to signal that Ukraine's ability to impose such costs justified sustained support. The psychological dimension was just as significant. For Russia's leadership, Valdai is a symbol of control and security. Temporarily blinding its defenses, even without structural destruction, undermined that image. For operators on the ground, the realization that perfection was required and still insufficient was deeply unsettling. As systems were rebooted and damage assessed, one fact stood out: the operation had achieved its core objective without escalation beyond the immediate target area. Yet the message was unmistakable. If this level of disruption could be achieved here, where else might it be possible? And as analysts began to tally costs and consequences, a larger strategic question loomed. How would this moment reshape calculations, not just in Moscow, but across the wider war? By the time dawn broke over the Valdai forest, the physical damage was already being assessed, but the strategic damage was only beginning to register. This was the moment when numbers, psychology, and geopolitics converged. The key question now facing Moscow, NATO, and Washington alike was unavoidable. Had the rules of protected space quietly changed? On paper, Russian officials emphasized success. The vast majority of incoming drones were intercepted. From a narrow technical perspective, that claim held weight. Yet modern warfare does not reward percentages. It rewards outcomes. The drones that slipped through struck exactly where they needed to, briefly silencing radars, command links, and electronic warfare systems guarding one of Russia's most sensitive sites. In strategic terms, that margin of failure was decisive. For Russia, the consequences extended far beyond Valdai. Every interceptor fired represented not just a cost, but an opportunity lost elsewhere. Analysts from Defense News and Military Watch magazine have noted that Russian air defense assets are already stretched thin across occupied territories, logistics corridors, and critical infrastructure. Redirecting high-end systems to protect leadership sites forces difficult trade-offs. Either the battlefield thins or symbolic centers are exposed. There is no third option. Economically, the strike reinforced an uncomfortable trend. Ukraine continues to impose disproportionate costs, using comparatively inexpensive systems. This asymmetry aligns with broader Western strategy. Under President Donald Trump, the United States has maintained that sustained pressure rather than rapid escalation remains the most effective path. NATO's role, while often understated publicly, is central intelligence sharing, training, and strategic coordination enable Ukraine to conduct operations that amplify impact without crossing alliance red lines. Psychologically, the effect may be even longer lasting. Valdai was supposed to embody invulnerability. Its temporary disruption punctured that narrative not through destruction, but through demonstration. Western experts have described this as confidence erosion warfare, a method aimed at forcing adversaries to question their own assumptions. Once doubt enters the equation, defense becomes more expensive, more reactive, and less efficient. Looking ahead, the implications are clear. Autonomous systems will play a larger role. Saturation tactics will become more refined. High-value sites will require ever greater investment to protect even as resources remain finite. NATO planners are already absorbing these lessons, aware that the same dynamics could apply elsewhere in future conflicts. And this brings us to the final question for viewers. If 4 drones can momentarily blind a billion-dollar fortress, what happens when the next operation targets something even more essential? The Valdai drone strike was not about destruction. It was about exposure. Ukraine demonstrated that even the most heavily defended sites can be disrupted through scale deception and autonomy. Russia intercepted most of the drones, but at enormous financial cost, expending scarce missiles and revealing limits in its air defense doctrine. A small number of precise hits achieved outsized effects by temporarily disabling radar command and electronic warfare systems. Strategically, the operation reinforced NATO's broader approach, impose sustained economic and psychological pressure, rather than seek dramatic escalation. Under President Donald Trump, U.S. support remains focused on enabling Ukraine to exploit asymmetry, forcing Russia into costly defensive choices. The message was clear: invulnerability is an illusion, and defending it is expensive. Looking forward, similar tactics are likely to spread. Autonomous drones, saturation attacks, and functional targeting will shape future battlefields. The real question is not whether defenses can stop most threats, but whether they can afford to stop them indefinitely. So, what do you think? Does this kind of operation change the balance of the war, or does it risk pushing defenses toward even greater escalation? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you want deeper analysis like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for the next update.